Hello AP Biologists, Mrs. Grider here to talk a little bit about nutrient cycles. This video is meant to clarify this packet you got for summer homework and also to give a little bit of context about why we're talking about nutrients in the first place. So, by the end of the video, you should know what a nutrient is, the basics of each of the three cycles, how these nutrients are used in you and other living things, and how humans have influenced these cycles. So let's get started. What is a nutrient? It's kind of an ambiguous word that gets used a lot, but I define a nutrient as any molecule that an organism is using to maintain homeostasis, we'll talk about what that means in a second, and or to gain energy and mass. Essentially what that means, any molecule that a living thing, an organism, plant, animal, bacteria, fungus, that it is using to survive. You looked at 3 nutrient cycles in the packet, and I'm going to go into each of them: water, carbon, and nitrogen. When I talk about carbon today, I'm specifically going to be talking about the molecule glucose, which its chemical formula is right here, C6H12O6. It's not pure carbon, but it has 6 carbon atoms in each glucose molecule. Similarly, for nitrogen, we're really going to be talking about molecules that have some nitrogen in them, that have either ammonium, which is an NH4, a nitrate, an NO3-, or a nitrite, NO2-. Once again, not pure nitrogen, but nitrogen contained inside other important molecules. So I just want to clarify what I mean by maintaining homeostasis a little bit more. Homeostasis is the regulation of an organism so that the internal conditions inside that organism remain stable and relatively constant. This is a really good thing for you. You want to maintain homeostasis. That means that your temperature stays relatively constant, even if the world around you is changing. Your pH, how acidic or basic your body is inside, remains about constant. How much oxygen and carbon dioxide you have, how many nutrients, those molecules that you need, are available to your cells. That's what it means to maintain homeostasis. Maintaining homeostasis keeps you alive. Without it, if all of those factors were just going all over the place, you would not be able to survive. So organisms use nutrient molecules in order to keep everything A-OK inside themselves, maintaining homeostasis. I also said that we need nutrients in order to get energy. So we actually get energy when we break down the bonds in molecules and use the energy from breaking that stuff down to power our cells. So here's that glucose molecule. You can see those carbons here in the glucose. Your cells actually spend a lot of time ripping the glucose molecule apart, which releases energy, and then they use that energy to do other stuff, to make our cells go and accomplish the stuff that we need. The last thing that we use nutrients for is to gain mass. So gaining mass means that you add more molecules to yourself and you grow. Sometimes we grow up, sometimes we grow out, but all of that happens because we added molecules to our organism. So that's covered here in the second bullet point. By adding nutrient molecules to our body and storing them, we can grow. Or sometimes we do chemical reactions that rearrange the atoms in the molecule to make it into a different molecule that we can add to us to help us grow. So an example of that is glucose right over here, same one that we looked at in the previous slide. Your body does a series of chemical reactions to rip this apart and to use it as part of making this molecule called alanine. So alanine has some carbons, some oxygen, some hydrogens that all come from this glucose molecule. And then your body is able to use that alanine in particular to add to its proteins to help those molecules and parts of your body grow. So we can either store the molecule or we can rearrange the atoms to make a new molecule that's useful to us. All right, here's the water cycle. I said you needed to know the basics. So you should know these key words. What is precipitation? What is evaporation? What is percolation? You should know all those steps and the order that they happen in. I want to point out a couple of key points here. The first is that when we talk about precipitation and evaporation, we're talking about a phase change, like you talked about in your chemistry classes. In precipitation, these clouds, which are water vapor or gas, are becoming liquid precipitation that comes down to the earth. In evaporation, the opposite is happening. These water molecules that are liquid here in the ocean or another body of water are turning into gaseous molecules of water and heading up into the atmosphere. So we have a phase change right here, one of the few that is present in these nutrient cycles. The other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit more is transpiration right here with these trees. One of the things that I said in our initial slide is that we need to be paying attention to how living things are involved in the nutrient cycle. Here's another diagram of transpiration, and that's simply how plants are using water. Plants absorb water from the soil, so when it rains, we get water here from the precipitation in the soil, and then plants in their roots absorb that water right up here. It actually ends up traveling up through the plant and then evaporates out the top. So transpiration is a really particular form of evaporation in which instead of just evaporating directly from a body of water into the atmosphere, the water travels through the plant, is sometimes used by the plant, or it just evaporates out the top. So transpiration happens with those plants. In terms of why water is important to you as a human, you are made mostly of water. You're more than 60% water by weight, and it's used in your body mostly to maintain homeostasis and in some cases to do chemical reactions that rearrange those molecules. Water is a requirement for life on Earth. Every living organism that we know about has water in it and uses water in order to maintain homeostasis. Now, in terms of how humans can influence the water cycle, this is a question that came up in number 10 of your packet here at the bottom of page 2 of the questions. And it talks about how the water cycle is a closed system. That means that water moves through, water is recycled throughout this system. We aren't making new water in the clouds or in the oceans. Water, the same water is moving from the atmosphere into the bodies of water here on the earth. And that means when stuff gets in, because the water is recycled, that it contaminates the water and those pollutants can't get out. So here's another diagram of the water cycle that adds in some of those human or anthropogenic, that means human created, sources of pollution. The pollution goes up into the atmosphere along with the water in the clouds, and then when it rains, that pollution, which was in that water in the clouds, comes down to the earth and can really hurt the organisms that are using the water when it comes back down. So one way that this happens is with acid rain. These chemicals that come from these factories in our homes that go up into the clouds can create an acidic solution here in the clouds, and then when it rains, that rain actually has that acid still inside of it. So we need to be careful with our water sources because if we pollute them, those pollutants get recycled throughout the system. All right, that's the water cycle. Moving on to carbon. You gotta know the basics of this one too. I've tried to add a little bit of color to this to help clarify what I think is the most confusing part of the carbon cycle. So once again, remember with carbon that we're talking really about glucose. So here up in the atmosphere, we have carbon dioxide, CO2. And I'm gonna follow this arrow right here. This arrow represents photosynthesis. Plants actually take that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they use it to make glucose. So these plants are using the CO2 to make glucose here on that arrow. When humans and other animals and insects eat those plants, ooh, my cursor's going crazy, eat those plants, we eat that glucose, which is why I have it highlighted here in green. The glucose that is made in those plants via photosynthesis, we eat, okay? Now, both plants and animals also do something called respiration. We exhale or release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So, the glucose that we have consumed, some of that is turned into carbon dioxide, and that is released back up into the atmosphere. I know that right now your mind is a little blown and you're going, Ms. Grider, I do not understand how this glucose stuff that you're talking about is becoming something that I breathe out and exhale. Have no fear. We will talk about it in a few months. But right now I just need you to trust me that your body is using the glucose that you eat and then is exhaling it via carbon dioxide, okay? Plants do that same process. They release a little bit of carbon dioxide. And then, so that means that we have this cycle. Photosynthesis, putting carbon dioxide into the plants. Respiration, releasing the carbon dioxide back up into the atmosphere. You're made of carbon too. You're 18% carbon by weight. And like I said, the most important molecule that we'll talk about with carbon is glucose. So we get it from the food that we eat. Plants make it using carbon dioxide and energy from the sun. So right here, plants, animals with the glucose. Glucose is a multitasking nutrient. It is super important in your body for so many reasons. One, we break it down to release the energy from its bonds to power our cells. Two, we grow because of it. We store it for later and use that molecule when we need it. Three, glucose can undergo chemical reactions to make new molecules that help an organism grow. So that example I gave earlier in the video, glucose is ripped apart and rearranged to make new molecules like alanine that we need in order to be healthy. And lastly, glucose is super highly regulated via homeostasis so that cells can break it down for energy at any moment. You've heard of people who are diabetic. Diabetics have problems with their insulin, which is used to regulate their glucose. So if you know someone who has diabetes, they might talk about checking their glucose levels, injecting themselves with different things to fix their glucose levels. That's because glucose is so important to making your cells run and keeping your cells healthy. All right, I'm now going to switch to a different part of the carbon cycle. I'm going to switch to this human part right over here. The auto and factory emissions, the combustion that does not come from this eating and respiration, but instead comes from all of the stuff that humans do that needs carbon to power it. So here at the bottom of the diagram, it has what we call a carbon sink: coal, oil, peat, and natural gas. Those are all of the things that we use in order to power our cars, in order to power our electricity, which is generated mostly via burning all of these carbon sinks. So the carbon sinks come from what we call fossil fuel formation. That happens when really old carbon matter, dead animals, plants, gets compressed over millions and millions of years and turns into something that we can use as a fuel. And when we use it as fuel, we end up releasing carbon dioxide back up into the atmosphere. So when our cars run, the exhaust from our cars, the smoke that comes out of factories and from power plants, all of that heads back up into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. And because of this, you might have heard of something called global warming. So when we release all that carbon dioxide out into the air via cars and electricity usage, the amount of carbon dioxide goes up. This line right here is carbon dioxide. And then because of that, the temperature has been rising on planet Earth as well. So we are influencing the carbon cycle through the choices that we make, not just through eating stuff or breathing out, but via the realities of being an industrial person, right? So using a car, using electricity. All right. So carbon cycle. A good question to think about would be, how would the carbon cycle be different without us? Which parts of the carbon cycle would still be there? Which parts would not? All right, here is our final cycle, the nitrogen cycle. I've added a few notes here to try and clarify that in the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen is going through a bunch of different molecular forms. Some of them are pure nitrogen. Atmospheric nitrogen is just nitrogen, N2. When it talks about nitrogen fixing and nitrates in the soil, that means that the atmospheric nitrogen is going through chemical reactions which are turning it into different molecules that contain nitrogen. And those different molecules that contain nitrogen are the ones that you and I need, and plants and other plants and animals need, in order to maintain homeostasis, to gain mass and gain energy. So I've just added them here on the slide. I am not concerned that you know the chemical formulas or exactly what those molecules are, but I just want you to be aware that in each of these steps we are talking about chemical reactions. as in the carbon cycle, the nitrogen is first entering the nitrogen is first entering the cycle via plants for the most part. These plants right here that are first most important are called legumes. Legumes are a special category of plant that have the power to take nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil. This is really good for the soil, and it helps the plants and animals that all need nitrogen. So you'll notice that this comes out of the atmosphere. The legumes are helping to put it into the soil, and then other plants can use it, and animals can then eat those plants to get the nitrogen that they need in order to survive. So, atmospheric nitrogen, legumes are helping us out. Some common legumes are peas and peanuts. Legumes are helping us out down here, legumes are helping us out down here, and then other plants and animals have that nitrogen available to them. Then, via death and via decomposition, all that nitrogen will get cycled back into the atmosphere. All right, you're made of nitrogen too. You don't have a ton of it, but you got some. 3.2% nitrogen by weight. You've got nitrogen mostly in your DNA and in your proteins. This is hemoglobin, a protein that carries oxygen in your bloodstream. And when I talk about proteins, I'm not just talking about your muscles. I know that's a common misconception. We will talk a lot about different types of proteins, but there's tons of molecules inside you that help you run that all have nitrogen in them. Nitrogen. So nitrogen is really important for soil health. In order to have healthy soil that all types of plants can grow in, you need those nitrogen compounds in the soil. And because of that, it's a major component in fertilizers. So one way that humans impact the nitrogen cycle is that we add a lot more nitrogen into the soil than would be there without us. And because of this, we sometimes overuse fertilizers. There's too much nitrogen in the soil. And this makes it into rivers and lakes via percolation, back to the water cycle. So through runoff and percolation, water goes back through the soil to rivers and lakes and streams. And when there is a lot of nitrogen in those places, we can get what is called an algal bloom. An algae, like a plant, uses nitrogen. And so when there's extra nitrogen around, it blooms, it goes crazy, it multiplies and multiplies and multiplies because it has so much of this extra nutrient available to it. So this is a way that humans are impacting the nitrogen cycle. All right, so hopefully you have an idea of each of these things. If something in this video confused you, send me a message, a text, or an email, and hopefully I can clarify it for you. I hope this gave you a little bit of why we're talking about nutrients and also cleared up some confusion in the packet. Have a good day.